Hello, everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name's Samuel Oswald. I'll be talking to you today about drone-based phenotyping and how we can use it for research or commercial purposes. So, there we go. Next slide. So I'll start by introducing who I work for, Vito, then talk a bit about phenotyping, both traditional and drone-based methods, go more in depth on drone-based phenotyping applications, then introduce Mapio, which is our scalable end-to-end phenotyping solution, and finally give a treatment on how this solution can incorporate more advanced workflows, specifically object detection, which is becoming more and more important. So who is Vito? We're a leading European research institute. So we're based in Belgium and have around 1,000 employees. And we primarily work on bridging the gap between industry and academia, and particularly in terms of providing technology that builds towards sustainable futures in different fields. And so obviously our head office is in Belgium. We also have offices across Asia and the Middle East and work with various partners around the world. For example, within Australia, Stratus Imaging, who bring their own expertise in drone-based imaging in the local market. And so I work for the remote sensing team, and we work across a lot of different applications. There's roughly 100 people within our research unit alone. I, of course, am part of the phenotyping team, but we also look at even kind of larger scales, so across fields for actual growth monitoring and at different regional global trends, where we can combine satellite data, UAV data, as well as other airborne data. And so to go into phenotyping, I'm sure many of you are already aware, but it is the study of the plant environment interaction. And it can be done in numerous environments. So we can look in lab environments where we have quite controlled studies of different traits, different breeding lines and cultivars, all the way to the field where we will have less direct control due to natural forces and lots of unpredictable factors, but we do in return get agricultural relevance for our different traits. And so one of the limitations for this field level phenotyping is that it's required quite a lot of manual labor input. So here we can see an expert monitoring the field. To do so, they will typically use different survey methods. You can see here plant height being done, but there can also be kind of surveying or harvesting of different crops. But there are, of course, issues with this. It's quite time consuming. So if you have a lot of different trials, it is difficult to look at these trials across the entire field. So you'll need to instead sample certain areas. It's difficult to scale when you have lots and lots of different trials or traits going on at once, or if you're looking at trials across different regions. And of course, measurements are subjective and often invasive towards the crops. When we compare this with drones, here we're able to quickly get a bird's eye view of the canopy and produce lots and lots of different traits and generalize these for different crops. So we have, in of course, recent decades, started to have the technology to do this become more and more available. And what we do at Vito within the Mapio team is support you in setting up an operational workflow, helping you in finding out what traits and crops you can look at, and assisting you in making this a scalable process. And so to give a quick overview of Mapio, what is it? We provide objective digital measurements on plant traits. We can also provide additional data, such as through non-visible light spectrum, through the inclusion of multispectral cameras. We can provide data for all test plots, so there's no need to select certain sample points but instead you can have it for the entire field and compare everything. And we will then provide consistent data, which can be comparable both for every trial within a plot, but also over time and across different sites. And so why should you use drone-based phenotyping? You can speed up your phenotyping work. So this can result in shortened time to market and a reduced cost of breeding and testing different lines. And ultimately, this can lead to a higher breeding success rate as you will have more data available. And this in turn can result in you creating better quality seeds with more data and better insights behind them, higher accuracy in measurements, and a much more objective assessment of all of your different varieties as compared to when you might have subjective human measurements. And so now I'll just go over some of the different traits that are especially interesting in phenotyping. So classically, these can include things like plant height. So when we do take our drone images over a field, we're able to find common points between the images, which will then create a 3D model of the field. And from there, we can calculate the ground level, especially if we fly at an earlier date, and how the plant height changes over time and what it might be on certain dates. So you can see in the bottom right corner, when we've actually done some comparisons of certain plant heights at different points, we have found there is a high correlation. And deviation, of course, could be due to subjective measurement of the human rather than drone error. And so, of course, plant height has a lot of different applications. The height itself can be an indicator of plant health or vitality or ultimate yield, or it could be an indicator of a diseased plant. And sudden changes might indicate different changes in the plant condition. For example, in wheat, it's useful to calculate the date that you might have lodging, and so the death of the plants or these kind of things. And this can also then be quantified as a percentage for your different plots. Other applications might look at what we can see beyond the visible spectrum. So one thing that is, of course, very useful are these vegetation indices. This example looks at strawberry. And so in this test field, there were some samples which were infected with disease and some which were not infected with disease. So at the right, they were not infected with disease. Using just visual spectral information, it's not so easy to see when you do have disease or plants which are less vibrant, since from above they will just all look green like this. But then when you look at the NDVI, you can see that here in the end, which were the uninfected plants, you have much more robustness and a higher reflectance value, indicating that they are healthier. Other things can look at, say, growth rate and how this growth rate changes over time. So here we use cover mapping. So this is a spectral product which looks at the difference between plant material and non-plant material, and then presents that as a cover map. And so we develop these for different varieties, as well as using both multispectral or RGB imagery. And then this creates a useful metric for looking at growth over time and where plants might have lower cover or higher cover. And this can be a very key metric for looking at how your plants are growing. Of course, these are quite simple products that I've mentioned before. So they use either thresholding to look at the difference between plant and non-plant material, or look at height using a 3D model, or look at the difference between different bands to calculate products. But now we also look more and more at advanced object detection and AI work. So one example is when you're calculating plant emergence and trying to count the number of plants that are actually emerging at a certain time in a field. This is possible using cover maps. As you can see on the left, we are able to produce this cover, which is shown in green, but there are problems here. For example, it's hard to differentiate if you have weeds in the field, and also if you have overlapping plants, it's hard to differentiate between them. And so what we've worked on is providing an AI workflow which is able to actually count the plant emergence, not count the weeds and other plants which are not of interest, and then also be intelligent enough to detect when there is overlapping plants and correctly count them, which you can see is the case here, where we've calculated pretty accurately all of the actual plant emergence, even when there's high overlap and weeds within the field. And of course, object detection can also be very useful for things like organ detection. And in a lot of crops, this can be something that's a major predictor of yield. Like for example, in wheat, where we are able to count all of these different organs, which wasn't possible in the past when you had lower resolution images, or if you did capture at this high resolution, it would have been very time consuming and subject to a lot of possible error, as well as not being able to be predicted accurately due to the infancy of different machine learning models. So these are some of the things you can do with drone-based phenotyping, but there are challenges in actually implementing these workflows. So one thing, of course, is technical knowledge. If you are a researcher in plant domains, you might not necessarily have expertise also in image processing, which would require time to learn and then apply, and also to keep up to date with the current research, which is relevant to achieving the best results. In addition to this, there can be difficulties in standardizing your products. So if you are performing flights, let's say on an ad hoc basis, you might end up collecting them with different settings. So you might have, in the end, very different resolutions of the flights. They might be collected under dramatically different lighting conditions, which makes it harder to compare your results and more prone to different errors outside of the actual difference within the field. And this is particularly important for advanced applications such as object detection, where large data sets are needed to be leveraged. And so the last thing is, of course, scalability. So automation of these processes can be quite difficult if you are using a workflow or a framework that isn't so mature. And so that is where we come in with Mapio. And so the aim of Mapio is to provide a standardized image processing infrastructure, which can create useful tools to produce outputs which are comparable across time and location for several applications, and allow the user to focus more on their own area of expertise. And so this really goes from the initial stage. So we try to assist in the ordering of flights and the planning steps, all the way through to the upload of data, the processing, visualization through our web platform, and then the export into your own workflows, where you might combine it with your own data, either about your different varieties or with other data sources. And so here is kind of where we overview the different roles that we will have within Mapio. So the initial stage, of course, can be performed by project managers who will be planning what flights we need, how many we need, and what kind of outputs we will get. And then these can be passed on to pilots, either within an organization. However, we also, of course, work with different partners to provide these pilots and this flight expertise. And from there, we move through to the analysis step, which is performed by Vito in ensuring that the data quality is good before it can be provided to data analysts to inspect and then connect with their own data. And so we have a Mapio Academy learning seminar or learning sessions, which allow all of these steps to be gone through for the different users. And so, as I mentioned, the first step in preparing for drone phenotyping is the planning. And this is one of the most important steps, since it will then define what outputs you get. And you want to make sure that these outputs are as high quality as possible and suitable to your application. So we provide through our web platform tools to define your different locations, the contact details, And then from there, order your products. And so we have quite a suite of different products for different applications. Here you can see for wheat, for example, you might be able to use this drop-down list to select all of the different products that you might need. And then you can add various flight dates and state on which dates you want which products to be collected. And this might be something you're aware of yourself, or it might be something that you enlist help with in order to plan a nice flight schedule. So this is just an overview of a lot of the different products we offer. There are quite a few, and we are also, as a research institute, open to new products if there is something that, a trait that you want to detect which isn't covered by us. We are interested in finding out how we can accommodate that. And so these can include basic things like your base map, as well as crop health using multispectral. And then, as I mentioned, object detection applications such as crop count in maize, fruit counts in pumpkins, as well as many other things. We can look at flowering when you have maps of flowering or other kind of crop cover maps, as well as, of course, the height products and many others. And so in terms of hardware, we also realize there's a lot of different drone platforms. Some of them are suitable to different use cases. Some of them are more readily available, and the same goes for different cameras, as well as flight apps. Different pilots have their preferred apps. And so we're versatile to a wide range here. And because of the agnostic nature of our platform, we are able to include new ones. And of course, this is something where Stratus Imaging has quite some experience within the Australian market and access to quite a lot of different hardware as well. And so once you've prepared your products, you will go out and fly or have someone fly for you. At this point, we do provide a field software tool, which is able to facilitate the uploading of products directly to our servers. And in addition, it provides automated checks offline. So when you're in the field, no matter how remote you are, if you are able to copy the images to a laptop, it will check the metadata and the excess information, which can then be used to check that the data is complete. It covers your entire field. There are no consistency issues where, for example, if you had the camera blowing around or adopting different speeds, which might affect the final result. And this is very useful since with these drone flights, they are often quite time sensitive. It might be that if you do find that there is an issue later, then your opportunity to actually collect the data has passed. And certainly, and especially within the Australian market, you might have trials and fields which are located far away, and it's not so feasible to access them at short notice. And so we can, using our checks, ensure that even prior to upload, you won't encounter such issues. From here, the data will be put through our processing chain and then automatically uploaded to the Mapio web platform, where you can view all of your products for different fields, compare them across time, and look at several different inspection functions. So here you can already start to get an idea just by visual analysis of where you are having strong growth in your fields, where diseases might be present, as well as lots of other useful kind of overview tools, so you already can see what is happening within the field. But then, of course, the idea is to provide objective quantitative outputs. And so for this, of course, we will need to look at different trial plots and the statistical analysis of these. And so we provide tools to create these plots, particularly when you have a regularly shaped grid-based layout, which is the case, of course, for many crops, not for all. We provide a simple tool to delineate these. but you are also able to upload your own shape files if you already know where your plots are and have created them offline. And additionally, if there are specific cases, such as for lots of different vegetables where you might have irregular plots, we are able to assist in getting these set up. And so then this is just another look at how you can refine the plots. If you have created your plots or imported them, rather, it might be that they don't match up exactly. So through our field data tool, you are still able to select plots. In this case, you have some misaligned plots in the bottom row. However, by using this field layout, you can select all and move them. And so there are functions to move individual or small groups, and then just refine this field layout so that you can ensure that the statistics you generate will really follow the different plots that you have. And from here, you'll want to collect your data. So this can be done within the platform itself using our export function. We also provide an API to download information automatically. And so this can then be included into different notebooks or different data processing chains where you can look at the data within your own workflows. And so it's always provided in a standardized output, so including all of the field information for your different plots, and then standardized statistics for raster data, as well as for vector data, so that if you're looking at, say, including new products, you know that you will be able to include them in your workflows using the same methods as other products. And so this can then be integrated with third-party applications. Some examples are shown below. We have, for example, Watch It Grow for monitoring fields, where we're able to include Mapio data. And then other use cases, for example, this is for a project in Belgium, PC Fruit, which you can look at, where the data is then included into an application and compared with other data sources. So here you can see it includes satellite data, drone data, as well as soil and ground-based information. And so that's an overview of the workflow and how it works and how you can collect simple information. But I thought I would also go into some of the advanced applications which are becoming more interesting. One of these is, of course, object detection using machine learning workflows. And so this is something that in the past has been quite difficult for drone-based phenotyping. However, it is becoming more applicable, and this is due to several reasons. So firstly, the advancing computing power. So now, especially with cloud-based computing, there is a lot more access to GPUs and machines capable of modeling this data within reasonable times. There's also advances in model architecture and model theory. So in the past, with a lot of phenotyping applications, because we're typically looking at small objects which are densely packed within an image, architectures weren't so great at detecting them. They were always better at detecting when you have things like, you know, cars and other big objects which are easily detectable and took up large parts of the image. But these architectures are advancing, and so now we are able to better detect small fields of dense objects. And finally, we're starting to see high resolution cameras which allow images of sufficient quality to easily be taken. So you can see in the bottom on the left, if you see there is a large image that was taken using a phase 1 camera. In the top left, you have the same image, if it was taken at the same resolution, taken with a a Phantom 4 camera, it would only capture this small area. And so if you see then on the left, we have image C over here. When you are taking images of sufficient resolution with a Phantom 4 camera, the red boundary here indicates when you took images at the quality of BI, which is good for detecting objects, but because you weren't able to match features so well, you ended up not actually aligning images over the whole field. And sometimes it does work, but a lot of the times it doesn't, so it's quite risky to do. And then if you slightly reduce the resolution, you could capture more of the field, but still not all of it. And only at B3 could we capture all of the field. However, the image is no longer of sufficient quality to be used for object detection. And so some of the advantages then, if you do want to collect data for object detection, to use our workflow, we are able to aggregate data. So we, of course, ingest quite a lot of data from different applications, different sites, and this can be done either using kind of master models, so where we incorporate data from numerous researchers and numerous clients, or if you would like to keep control of your own data, you can, of course, keep it separate and have your own models developed. But this aggregation of data means that you will end up with lots and lots of samples over different locations, and then you'll be able to combine these into a single model where over time you will be able to train models, use less training data and more quickly receive accurate object detection results. And so we've also optimized towards phenotyping applications. So as I mentioned, like this involves selecting the appropriate model architecture and optimizing this architecture. We account for smart training data selection. And as mentioned, all of these result in you needing to reinvest less effort for new jobs. So you will require progressively less training data and be simultaneously more confident in the results. And so this is just an example of how we can enforce the rules for data selection. In our case, with object detection, we aren't looking for using all of an image as you might in other applications. We're looking at using particularly the nadir part of an image where we're looking at plants from above. As you can see in the bottom left here, when you look at these oblique angle images, they can be very different, and this kind of thing can make it both harder to tag because they kind of spread out in these very, very elongated positions. And then when you are looking at the nadir, it might affect the performance there. And so for the actual training itself, this is probably one of the most labor-intensive tasks for object detection. However, we, of course, as we have done quite a lot of it, have partnered with RoboVision, who are a platform for data annotation. And so we enlist remote annotation teams, which are trained for these phenotyping tasks, and they're able to output annotations in consistent formats quickly. And should you also wish to access and annotate your own images, it's possible that we can facilitate that with this accessible user interface. And so from there, we will download these annotations and begin work on training the model. We've of course optimized it. We augment the data to account for different things like brightness and contrast adjustment, rotating of the images, taking random samples of the images, and other things which really aren't always applicable in every object detection case, but get good results when you use them for phenotyping use cases. And so other things we look at include pseudo labeling. As I mentioned, these are quite complex annotation tasks. So you're looking at small objects in dense images, which are very noisy. And so even when you do try your best, you can see here that there are, say, roughly in the case of wheat detection, 5 to 10% of objects missed. And so this will result in error being propagated through the model as it misidentifies actual objects as being background. And so what we do is train weak models to first fill in these gaps and then use those training sets to train bigger models. And so in terms of performance, we found that generally they're quite good at this task. So firstly, for plant emergence, we can see that when looking at maize, so these were both trained on single sites. They already get very good results. So average precision at 0.5 IOU, intersection over union. what this means is that the model, when it outputs data, will compare the object it predicts with the training set. And if there's an object which overlaps more than 50%, then it will give it a tick and say that this is good. And so because we're looking at small objects, even slight changes in the prediction can result in objects not being accepted in terms of the results, whereas when we visually look, we can see that they are. So these are very good results, particularly in the case of potato. Pseudo labeling does increase it a bit in this case, but it's already very high. And so here's another figure of maize detection, and even at the base level, you can see that it starts to predict very well, even with overlap, which is also what we saw earlier. For other things, organ counting, of course, can be a bit more complex, since you're looking at these dense, kind of noisy images with lots of leaves in the background, lots of overlapping objects, and often even smaller than before. So one test we did here was looking at how the generalization would go, looking at 4 separate sites. So here we have site 1 and site 2. One thing to note is that site 2 did have a lot of poorly annotated data. And when we did look at only using the site, we did get good results. But even when we excluded the site, you can see that both for site 1 and site 2, without data from that site, you got good comparable results. In the case of site 2, which, as I mentioned, is poorly annotated, you actually got the best results of all. And then as you continue, you could improve these results with augmentations, or of course, including the site data. And then for pseudo labeling, one thing to note here is for pseudo labeling, it is difficult to optimize. You can see at the right that there is some degree of test set error, since, as I mentioned earlier, the actual annotations can have some gaps. But we can see, looking at, if you can see it, the red boxes, they do miss quite a bit in these images. And as you do include pseudo labeling, you include more objects. However, if you use a low confidence interval, so where you accept more pseudo labeled objects, you will end up with false objects such as leaves being detected. So this is something that there is some work to optimize, but as you do include more data, you are able to better optimize this. And so that concludes the presentation portion of this session. So just to conclude, I'll say drone-based phenotyping allows for fast and accurate trait recordings to be done across the entire field. There's several general products that can easily be calculated from drone imagery, with application-specific outputs also able to be developed. The biggest limitation for users is just having the technical knowledge to produce this image, or to process this imagery rather, and to do them consistently, and eventually to do them at scale across several sites and time points. And so Mapio allows users to easily work through the processing workflow from beginning to end. And finally, we also, of course, as a research institute, are striving to be on the cutting edge of this domain. And so we look at things like object detection and the leveraging of large data sets to produce accurate estimations of plant emergence, organ counts, and other features. All right, so now I'll check the Q&A. If you have anything else, you are free to add it to this Q&A, and then I'll go over this at the end. But if you have any other questions afterwards, or would like to contact us, you can, of course, do so either to Stratus Imaging, who is our Australian partner, of course, or myself at Vito. Okay, so I'll get into that.
Okay, thanks, Sam, and
no problem.
Thank you very much for running us through that. That I think was very interesting, and the level of detail that research is going into to make sure that non-subjective decisions and results can be given. It's great. So as Sam mentioned, we'll now spend some time going through questions. We've actually got 23 questions already that have been submitted, and that's been through the initial registration. So we'll run through some of them, and And Sam has already answered those questions, so it shouldn't take us too long to go through some of them, and others there will be a little bit more detail. So the first question that we've got in here is, how can drones be used for phenotyping? And I think your last slide there, Sam, sort of answered that, where you mentioned about allows for fast and accurate trait recordings to be done across the entire field. And it's obviously the latest in technology, and taking away that time that people spend out in the field having to walk and go through it. So certainly I think from your presentation, we've got the answer there, that drones can be used in phenotyping. To build on that, the next question that we've got is, how many labeled images do you actually require for training AI and getting that level of detail that you've mentioned?
So this can be very different depending on the application. Normally in cases, so like this plant emergence, that's a much simpler case. And so you would need less images. As a rough general rule, if you're working on a single orthomosaic, it's quite possible to get a good model there, probably using around 100 images or 100 crops from an image. And so what I mean by that is because when you produce these orthomosaics, you have extremely large images. How we will then generate the training images is by taking different crops of roughly 512 by 512 pixels. But then with 100 images, depending on your application, you'll end up with a lot of different object examples. So if it's a more sparse plant emergence image, you might want to get those 100 images to actually get a good model. But for things like wheat, where you might have 100 objects in an image, even when you start looking down at lower amounts of images, like around 50 images, you can get a good result. But then to generalize, you will want to do this for several images. And what you will find as you start to include more sites, which represent different environments, different edge cases for objects, you will start to see that you require less training images for future jobs, because at some point you might want to use them just to validate it, but you will start having a very generalized model.
Thank you. The next question that we've got is around, you mentioned the importance of capturing data and making sure the environmental conditions are similar. The question that we've got is, how are you accounting for that incident light calibration across multiple flights?
Yeah, so there's several ways to do this. In the case of multispectral cameras, what we do is use things like sun sensors and calibration pads. And so these are able to calculate, the different lighting conditions which might affect the output result and account for them. In the case of RGB imagery, this isn't so useful, but also in the case of RGB imagery, normally you aren't so interested in the lighting. Obviously, the one thing is you want to get them under as close to ideal conditions as you can. So normally that's going to be in the middle of the day, not at sunset or sunrise, where you have a lot of different lighting differences. But then for things like plant height and the kind of RGB metrics, you'll usually be able to calculate these with a pretty broad range of lighting conditions. And then, as I mentioned as well, for more advanced applications like in object detection, we already look at augmenting the data to kind of account for edge cases under different lighting conditions. So that's how we kind of approach this.
Thank you. Looking at our list of attendees that we've got, we do know that there are some that have already got drones, some that are potentially looking at drones. And you also mentioned about the ability for us to organise people to come out and actually fly the sites. Mm-hmm. If someone's got their own drone or they're looking at doing this, so that while they're out there doing some of their own sampling, while they're actually out in the field and they want to take that drone flight, what do you recommend for the drones and the types of sensors and the resolutions that we're actually looking at for some of these outputs that you've mentioned?
Yeah, this is very dependent on what it is you're looking at. So if you, for example, wanted to look at these kind of fine object detection resolutions, then in the case of these organ counts in noisier images, you would really be trying to get something as high resolution as you could. So ideally with a high megapixel camera, at say 1 millimeter to 2 millimeters resolution. For things like plant emergence, if you are looking at larger plants emerging, so where you might have like a plant that ends up taking 2 centimeters of space when you view it from the top down, you can get away with less, so around 2 millimeters. And then for other products, it's dependent. So normally in the case of multispectral, these by nature aren't as high resolution as RGB cameras, but they also don't need to be. If you're looking at NDVI of plant leaves, we're normally looking at around 2 centimeters resolution. And then for things with RGB cameras, which aren't looking at these fine object detection domains, you can go closer to between 5 millimeters and 1 centimeter resolution. So normally you will aim to go for the highest possible resolution, but this is constrained by the camera you're using. So for things like the Phantom 4 RGB, it's going to start getting more difficult to get good quality data if you go at finer resolution than 5 millimeters. And if you're looking at a larger site, maybe it's not going to be feasible to capture all of the data in time.
Thank you. So that sort of builds on to the next question we've got here is, how accurate can plant identification be through drones? And is there also a quality, reliable app that Vito, Mapio are bringing out to have on the phone for also that identification?
Yeah, it can definitely be very accurate. So I've gone through where we're kind of at the moment in terms of this identification. As we kind of move on, we are looking at lots of different kind of high advanced applications. So this is going to be looking more, rather than just detecting objects, detecting features of the objects. So for example, the size of different organs, which is something we already do in certain fruits such as pumpkin, as well as disease presence based on an object level. We do disease mapping, but more using threshold based methods at the moment, such as similar to the cover mapping. But there's definitely a lot of different traits that can be developed, and these are becoming, there's more and more possibilities development because we are just seeing so many advances both in the quality of cameras, the availability of computing power, and all of these kind of things. In terms of apps, for phone apps, we do look at things similar to what I showed you in one of the last slides for integration with third parties, such as with the PC Fruit. And then it becomes a question of, just developing these additional platforms where we can present our data in. And then, of course, in the field, we provide an app, although it is a laptop-based app at the moment, where you can, of course, already check the data prior to upload as well.
Thank you. We've actually had a couple of questions that have come in, and I'm going to join a couple of these together. Mm-hmm. And we've got phenotype or phenology at a coarser resolution. So if we're not necessarily looking at research trial plots, which might be that 20 meters by 2 meters or 10 meter or even smaller, What advantages are there of a finer resolution over, say, a paddock scale? Can that be done? And not only that, but when it's actually being flown, are the algorithms being run in real time, or is it needing to be done post-capture processing? And then if it is done post-capture processing, a lot of the questions are around the timeliness of getting this data back. So what sort of timeframes are we looking at from when a flight is undertaken to typically when our clients can actually receive that information back?
Yeah. So for this, it's a bit dependent on the quantity of data. So when you are looking at larger scale sites, it can take a bit more processing time, as it is quite a complex algorithm to actually align the data, as well as just to upload. So when you perform the flight, if you are doing it, especially in a remote area, the pilot will likely need to come back to the office and deliver it. But then on our end, so once we receive the data, normally we do it within 48 hours. And this is for the production of the kind of basic products. And then for more advanced products, so object detection, this will depend a bit on the application that you're looking at. So if it's something that we already have a mature model for, you will also be looking at this 48-hour period or a bit longer. If it's for a new model, then we would need to also annotate the data, and the normal turnaround time for this is around 10 days. But it really then depends on, what the product is that you want to collect. So for these general products, we're refining our processing also to automate out the last, there is one step that is still manual, which is the alignment of GCPs. If you're using kind of high resolution RTK cameras, this is already removed, and so you can, or you're not including GCPs for whatever reason, you can receive these certainly very quickly, which would be within the 48 hours. And normally for the general products, once you have this GCP tag step done, then it would be within 48 hours. So the actual processing time normally varies from between 1 to 5 or 6 hours, and then there is this one human step.
Thank you. Next question that we've got is around when you're capturing images, we don't have those absolute perfect conditions where there's absolutely no wind around or anything like that. So the crops are moving due to the wind. How does that get dealt with in the processing?
Yeah, so for this, what we do is we are taking images at the nadir. So when you are producing these orthomosaics, what you will generally see is a top-down view at the point of capture. And so this can, then of course, have issues on especially windy days. But normally it will still get generally good results. One thing that we also look at, and this is something that is applicable over larger areas, especially when you want to collect high resolution data as well, but it also has a side effect of being useful for these windy days, is doing an RGB sampling technique. So here, rather than producing orthomosaics, we will look at capturing a single image using RTK drones, so very precise GPS coordinates, to instead try and capture an entire plot in one image. And then here you will not have so many issues with the alignment. But otherwise, normally in terms of alignment, it doesn't affect this too much, as it's not the crops themselves that are being used for alignment in most cases, but the space between them. So if you have dirt and grass between them, or say corners of plots, these will be where the alignment comes into play. But certainly, or if you did want to remove this kind of blur between different images, then it would be worth looking into things like RGB sampling strategies.
Okay, thank you. We'll move into some of the questions now, a bit more specific to the results and also crop types. So what sort of success has been seen for Mapio Vito in wheat breeding selection?
Yeah, in wheat breeding selection, this is something that we've worked fairly extensively in. And so, yeah, we've got quite a lot of experience in it. Some of the examples I showed you were specifically relating to wheat breeding selection. And so these could include things like the lodging and looking at when lodging occurs in different trials. We've also helped clients develop notebooks which compare, say, different heights for different trials scattered across the fields, and which varieties, when you have different trials for a certain variety, show the most consistent results, which show inconsistent results, which respond to diseases, and lots of other different tests. And of course, wheat is something that we've looked at a lot with our new object detection workflow, since it is something we work with a lot. And so you saw, I think, in the latest slides, some examples of the success we're having in terms of being able to detect the actual wheat heads themselves, which is, of course, then going to be a major predictor for yield, and then subsequently very useful for breeding selection.
Thank you. And that sort of leads on, one of the questions was, can the software be used to give you sound plant establishments in, well, specifically wheat and canola, and whether that can be taken out to other cereal crops as well?
Yeah, certainly. This is something that, yeah, is a big part of what we work, and this plant establishment. Certainly, we've got experience both in wheat and canola. So yeah, and that was also within the Australian market, partnered with Stratus Imaging. We looked at the canola establishment, which was also in that case quite small objects, but we did yeah, see good results in looking at this establishment. So the workflow itself is yeah, quite general and can be adapted, especially I'd say for a lot of cereal crops. It's particularly well suited, as this is one of the big applications that we look at across the world, and one that our platform has been developed with a kind of look into optimizing for.
And building on that one for canola as well, and I think you showed it there, was the ability to detect canola flowering and look at those percentages of canola flowering. I think you had a slide up there showing the ability to detect flowering. So obviously that's something that you've either tried, have you, in canola with good results as well?
Yeah, indeed. So flowering, there are two different approaches that we adapt. And so this can either be based on color thresholding. So if you have flowering that is very distinct from the other plant material, you can look at which plots you start to receive any amount of flowering, or which plots are considered to be flowering if you show a certain percentage of flowers appearing. And then also it is something that when you have high enough resolution, can be accomplished using this object detection workflow, but with these as the training objects.
Thank you. The next question is, can you measure photosynthesis?
The photosynthesis, this is something that is usually looked at in terms of proxy metrics. So in a lot of plants, using multispectral imaging, NDVI, or other vegetation indices will show kind of a correlation with the health of the plant and the photosynthetic activity. And so this can kind of vary a bit depending on the plant. Some show high NDVI results. Some it would be another metric like MCARI or using red edge indicators. But certainly this kind of the photosynthetic activity is often captured in these multispectral indices.
Thank you. So is there a way that by you mentioned about multispectral and also you've got hyperspectral as well to actually get an accurate measurement on solar induced fluorescence or SIF?
Yeah, for these, we're looking at a kind of separate workflows a bit. It would need to be something we'd need to develop. So for this kind of solar activity, it's not something, along with many hyperspectral indices, that we've so far worked with Mapio, and that's for a variety of reasons. Hyperspectral data is obviously quite dense, but it is something that we are interested in working in, of course, and it's something that with In Vito, we have had some experience with some of our other units. So certainly if you wanted to go into more depth over this, you can contact us and I can see what we can find out.
Thank you. And I think that builds on again from what you were saying is that more questions that get asked, the deeper that you can actually delve into this and provide more answers for some of these questions as well.
Indeed.
So when you're flying let's say a research trial plots, that you potentially have got different growth stages actually occurring across plots or even potentially within inside of a plot. Is there a way that you can actually manage and monitor and understand what that variance is?
Sorry, could you just repeat the start of the question?
So is there a way that when you fly a research trial plot that you can actually determine the various stages of plant growth across the whole trial and also potentially in each individual plot?
Yeah, indeed. So this is something that we look at. If you are looking for these different plant stages, we do provide growth curves, or growth curves can also be calculated using our outputs for different trial plots. And then if you know the growth stages before, they can, of course, be included in a model to automatically detect. So this is something we've done using notebooks in the past, where as new data is included, it is ingested into these notebooks, which then produce different visual results. But it also is something that, yeah, can be calculated once if you don't know beforehand, by comparing different growth curves, as well as visual analysis. And so in the end, you can see when different trials reach different growth stages, when they begin to decline, when they peak. And this also will be a bit determined by the amount of times you fly. So if you did want to get a more accurate, finer resolution growth curve, then you would want to fly more often. The amount of time you do fly, or the amount of times you do fly, will depend a bit on the crop and when how fast their growth curve is, when they decline, and what things you might expect to happen at different growth stages, which could be, of course, having plants flowering, having greater coverage, having higher height and then declining height, or higher plant reflectance in multispectral bands, such as through NDVI. And so we use all of these things when we're looking at the growth stages of plants to find out when they're occurring across different trials.
Thank you. That's a lot of detail that goes into actually all these algorithms and being able to determine these results, which is great to see. So we've just had another question come up, and I'll bring it up now because we have spoken about wheat and canola, is can you actually count the wheat heads per square meter in the spike length?
Yeah, so in terms of wheat heads per square meter, we do of course count that. So when we output our count products, what you will receive is for your different plots, both the count of the plots, and then we also, for each plot, will calculate the area of that plot. And then from there, you can count the density. Per square meter is, of course, the most common, but with whatever measurement metric you want. In terms of spike length, this is something that we're working on. As I mentioned, for example, in some fruits such as pumpkin, we do calculate the diameter of plants, but it is a bit determined by the type of plant. So obviously in pumpkin, it's quite easy to calculate the diameter since in almost all cases, you can just take the largest edge and that will be equivalent to the diameter. In terms of wheat, as we saw, the wheat heads can really be facing at a lot of different angles. And so to calculate the actual spike length is quite difficult if you're just looking at these objects from top down. It is something that in the future is something we want to look at and refine, but for now it is quite difficult to do. So normally to actually get the spike length, in the case of wheat, you will want to use the 3D model itself, which is certainly something we will be looking at in the coming years. Since, of course, as these models mature, we will also look at more in-depth applications. But to do so, we will likely access the 3D model itself and do a 3D classification of the object and then get the dimensions such as the volume and various lengths from that.
Thank you. We have got a few more questions there. What I'll do is I'll actually answer some of these because I think Sam's already answered these in the actual presentation. One of them was, can we actually upload from a hyperlink, and what options are being able to upload those images? And I think, as you mentioned in your presentation there, Sam, the process of if someone was self-flying, that we would actually take them through that whole process and show them how to upload their images and make sure that what they were delivering was right, and so that the right outputs could be provided. So that is certainly something that would be provided. You also did touch on the crop yield and how that would work, both using drone, and you also mentioned about satellite can come into that as well on larger scales. Mm-hmm. One question that we have got, which is quite specific for a crop, which is what traits can Mapio deliver for sorghum?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, so for sorghum, it's similar to many crops. We look at the general outputs. So this can include things like the height, cover, and then from there, we will look at the specific applications. So if it is also the case where you want to do an organ count, this is also possible in sorghum, and for plant emergence, it can be done. But yeah, for any other applications, of course, many of them are translatable between basically any crop you can think of. For specific traits, if there is something, yeah, that we haven't heard of or that you think I would really like to see this, yeah, feel free to contact me and I'll see what it is that we could do to capture that trait.
Thank you. A question that we had was, and it's not necessarily specifically around plots or looking at paddock scale cropping, was, is it possible for this technology to be used for biosecurity monitoring, plant identification and disease status?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. This is yeah, something that we look at. So these are all kind of more advanced traits and detections, but we do look at a lot of detection of diseases. And then for more specific identifications, like of different plants, biosecurity, and of course, diseases, this is something that can also be detected using our object detection workflows. And then as these get more mature, we will look more into, say, attribute detection, which can be useful for these applications.
Thank you. We've just got 3 more questions left.
Yep.
So hopefully we won't keep people too much longer. This has been recorded though, so if you're unable to be with us until the end of these questions, we will be sending that out to everyone as well, so you won't miss out. One of the questions, the third last question that we've got is, are you able to give examples of challenging community drivers or concerns in phenotyping or the AI work?
Yeah. So there is, in terms of community drivers, I think that we see a lot lately of relating to the AI. So yeah, as we are finding more advanced technology, the possibilities go up, and also yeah, there's more challenges in how to achieve these possibilities, because it's known that there should be a way with higher resolution imagery and more drone flights. And so in terms of examples, these are things like for the AI work, being able to differentiate things like crops from weeds, being able to account for, now that we are training these models, the different annotation problems due to having such small and dense imagery. But it's something that we are very interested in, and of course relish the opportunity to overcome them.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So the last 2 questions sort of almost can be combined, but I won't combine them. How much better can the image technology get, and what confidence can breeders get with the present day technology of drones?
Yeah, certainly. In terms of how much better than they can get, well, that's something that is really like changing at a rapid rate, and they're still improving. This is still technology that in a lot of ways is in its infancy. So even probably in the last decade or so, there's been a lot more adoption of drones, but it's still not something that is fully adopted within the phenotyping world. And so with that, there's still a lot of ideas that haven't fully been explored, and definitely a lot of potential improvements in how things can be achieved. So, I mean, an obvious improvement is just with camera technology. As we start seeing more and more high resolution cameras, both in RGB and multispectral domains, we can expect that there will be more and more adoption of advanced metrics like object detection, which of course will themselves improve as we have greater machine or better quality machine learning architectures, more computing powers. And then in terms of what's currently possible, there are, in terms of confidence, for some of the traits and metrics that have been developed earlier, and these are things like plant height. They're becoming quite confident. The predictions, because we are able to get such high quality 3D maps by using structure from motion, and of course this only increases as you get even higher quality images, which give these very accurate 3D models. Likewise for things like vegetation indices from multispectral imaging, because we're able to calibrate all of these images and ensure that the reflectance values are consistent, we can be confident in the vegetation indices that are output. And for some of the traits and applications that are becoming more used, such as object detection, machine learning, and different kind of mapping models as well. These are also, as the models become more mature, as you include more data, you start to become more confident in the results. But certainly even now, things like plant emergence, as we look at the data and the models we've developed, are already something you can be quite confident in. Likewise for organ detection, they are very good at just being able to detect the fine differences between leaves or between the internal structure of plants to accurately detect them.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And that leads us on to actually our last question, and also brings into play a little bit about Stratus Imaging and what we've been doing in this space. And you've mentioned about how technology is always advancing and new sensors are coming out, more definition in those sensors, which is also therefore providing the ability to get deeper and more detailed insights when you're looking at this type of phenotyping. And exactly that Stratus Imaging are now actually getting a whole new system of the latest drones, the latest multispectral cameras in thermal as well, and exceptional high resolution RGB cameras to make sure that what you've been showing here, Sam, is we can deliver that. And the question that we've got is that we've had put to us is, if a self-operator or a researcher wants to get their own system to look at some of this insights, what would you sort of recommend as a good overall package for them to be able to go out and do their own work, with maybe not going into the full detail, as we know that's a quite expensive option when you're looking at all the different sensors, but for someone who's wanting to go out and do their own flights?
Yeah, well, this is something, as you mentioned, it is something that if you wanted to get these very, very high detail flights, it's going to be costly setups. Yeah, using these very, very high resolution cameras. But even to kind of get started, things like, yeah, some basic DJI drones like Phantom 4 Pros will already start to be useful to go and either collect some of the basic traits like height and cover at a lower resolution, or even start looking at what you can do at a higher resolution. And then, yeah, if you did want to delve even deeper, for sure, I'd recommend in the Australian market talking to Stratus Imaging, who does have a quite extensive set of all of the possible cameras and equipment that you can use, which you might want to look at as you delve deeper into drone-based phenotyping.
All right. Well, thank you, Sam, for that. And that actually winds up all the questions that we've had. Personally, I'd like to thank Sam for his time. He's currently over here in Australia and on holiday. So yeah, thank you for giving us your time. He's heading back tomorrow. And yeah, it's been a great overview, great insights into where this technology is actually taking us and what we can actually now deliver. And certainly we're looking forward to this next year in research and being able to work with a lot of partners to provide these insights that you have been speaking about and provide that support as well. So yeah, thank you very much from Andrew, myself, and also Sarah from Stratus Imaging, and look forward to speaking with people in the near future. And if you've got some questions that maybe haven't been answered or that you've thought about now, certainly email them through to Sam or myself or even Andrew. Andrew is just andrew@stratusimaging.com.au, and we can certainly help you out with that. So thank you, and thank you everyone for giving us your time.